Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar presented by HSG. Today's title is Evolving Your Physician Network, a topic which we work with a number of clients on. It's a big common problem that people say they have physician networks that are basically amalgamations of physicians, but they're not evolving to meet the needs of the organization, or at least not evolving as rapidly as the organization would like. So we're going to talk about that topic and some of the various issues surrounding it today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions during the webinar, you can submit those questions using the Webinar Questions tab on your control panel. We're going to hold those till the end of the webinar, but we will answer them at the end. We will not identify your name or your affiliation or title or anything like that. So the questions are submitted confidentially. Today's event will be available on demand for viewing on Tuesday, February 28th on the HSG website. And so if you have peers that you want to share this with or want to go back and review some of it again, it will be available relatively soon. That'll be the 28th. You should have received a link to a PDF of the slides and it was in your reminder email. The PDF is also available for download on our website page established for the webinar at hsgadvisors.com. On the home page, scroll to the bottom and click the button for webinars, and then click on the listing, and this title will show up, and you can access the handouts there. My name is David Miller. I'm managing partner of HSG, and I'm doing this by myself today. Usually we have 2 or 3 people involved in webinars, but we're so busy we just decided I could handle it. So let's jump into the webinar on evolving your physician network. First of all, kind of our reason for being. HSG works with clients to build high-performing physician networks so that health systems can address complex changes with confidence. It seems like all of our client hospitals and health systems are working in complex markets and have a lot of issues that are challenging. And so we're basically trying to help them move ahead and be confident that the things they're doing to develop their networks are appropriate. That's me. Not really much reason to dwell on that, but I've been doing consulting for about 20 years. Before that, was an executive with Norton Healthcare for about 15 years. And a lot of the stuff I did way back in the day is still relevant to this topic because we were doing a lot of work with physicians on quality and efficiency. And we'll talk about, as we talk through the topic for today, we'll probably touch on some things that I've been working on for many years. First, I want to talk about our model of physician networks, which are the physician network growth phases. And we see, you may have seen this before, we used to call it the life cycle, but we decided that wasn't the best title. But we see networks go through a relatively logical progression. First of all, starting with novices, and we see a lot of organizations who are just getting into physician employment, less of those each year, obviously, but in general, they don't have a very good handle on what resources they need to build, what physicians they need to employ, and how they need to focus on making progress with their network. So we see a lot of people in the novice stage. The next phase usually is a aggressive growth phase. And so they're in the growth mode, adding physicians, and generally not adding infrastructure and management capabilities at the same pace they add physicians. So we see a lot of organizations in this phase, in this growth mode, that are growing way faster than they really have the management capability, and things beginning to get out of control. And so they don't have the right indicators and metrics. They don't have the depth of management they need, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third phase is kind of the logical outgrowth of that, which is operational chaos. So we see a lot of organizations that are struggling to get control of their physician networks and get them focused, struggling to collect payments and do basic blocking and tackling around practice management, And I would say when we show this this slide to executives within health systems and hospitals, about 85% of the time they'll laugh and say that's where we are. Because I think from the executive perspective, they often do not feel like they have control of these networks, and there's a lot of chaos going on in the operations. Slowly but surely, we see networks begin to get focused strategically. So those are the clients that call us up and say, I guess maybe we need a strategic plan for this network for the first time, or we need to step back and think what we want the doctors to work with us out of the organizational strategy, and how do we put together a strategy for the group that is in concert with the organizational strategy. And so slowly but surely, organizations move into that mode. The fifth phase is the value-based phase, where they're beginning to work on value-based purchasing and beginning to manage indicators, and whether it's an Anthem or a Humana contract or a Medicare MIPS or macro-related indicator, beginning to be able to consistently across the group produce results that are unified and organized. And we see a lot of groups beginning to move into that phase because Medicare has put the pressure on. But many groups are not at that level at this point. And then finally, on the far right, high-performing networks with good physician leadership, clear vision of where they're going, good management, plenty of management infrastructure. The physicians have worked on value-based care for a while. And so those are the ones on the far right. Needless to say, networks don't kind of fit into these 6 categories perfectly. There may be aspects of the operation that are in chaos, but there may also be some strategic focus, and there may be physician leaders who are beginning to take the reins and guide the group in the direction they want it to go. So, these are not dichotomous categories, but rather you should think of them as phases that organizations move through at various paces, and some aspects of the organization may be moving faster than other aspects. In the work we do, we're really trying to move everybody to the right, and do that in 2 ways: improve the performance of the group, as well as increase its strategic value. So improving the performance means better operations, higher quality, being able to manage toward the metrics you need to manage toward, being able to begin to produce care at a price that's somewhat reliable. And the strategic value is beginning to leverage the group so that it has benefit to the health system beyond just sending referrals. So working with using the network to work with employers, and again, producing quality outcomes and costs at a reliable level, that sort of thing. So that's essentially what we're going to talk about today, and how we see organizations tackling that, and how we see organizations addressing different aspects of the network at various points along the path. In moving networks to the right on this curve, we really have 3 types of work we do to help them move in the correct direction. One is to focus on strategy, the strategy of the network, integrating it with the strategy of the organization, and that sort of thing. The second is more operationally focused, but network optimization. And we'll talk about that some today, and where on this curve it becomes a big issue. And then finally, value-based care, which again is when you're moving toward the right. We see a lot of people using tools that help them in that arena. So we're going to kind of talk about strategies and tactics along the curve that fit into those 3 buckets. We display this as a bell curve, but in fact, in our experience, it's not. And I did want to comment on that as well. We see, for example, in the value phase, we only see about 7% of the networks we're working with really addressing that effectively. from, if you look at operational chaos, we'd say that 50% of the networks we're working with are still in that phase. So it's and there are not many novices and not many high performers. But anyway, so it's not a perfect distribution, but is a representation of generally how the distribution falls. So what I want to talk about for the majority of the rest of the webinar is kind of what strategies, what you ought to be thinking about depending where you are on this curve. And we're going to start over on the left-hand side if you're a novice and talk about what you ought to be doing, and then basically just working our way to the right. So starting with the novice category, and the biggest thing that we think organizations who are just beginning to get into this need to think about is a physician alignment strategy. So an alignment strategy across all your physician enterprises, whether it's the employed network, the private doctors, whatever. And when we say physician alignment strategy, what do we mean by that? Or what are the elements of such a strategy? And essentially, I'd say it's a business plan for the group. You need to think through what's the physician complement that you need longer term, both primary care as well as strategically important service lines. And how can this group help make sure you have a vehicle to employ or to engage physicians so that you're basically addressing your physician needs? You need a manpower plan that's integrated with medical staff needs. So you need to begin to think about, we've got 5 or 6 doctors or we've got 10 or 12 doctors. What's this going to look like in 5 years? And what manpower is going to be employed by this network? And the next thing you need to think about is how they're geographically distributed across your market. And one question is geographic distribution appropriate, or should they be all centralized? But you need a plan on how you see that unfolding as well. Another thing you need to begin thinking about is the strategic piece of this and the metrics that you're going to use to say this was a strategic success. Not that you're going to achieve that in the novice category, but you need to start thinking about it. You need a well thought out infrastructure plan, including the frontline managers that you need, as well as the physician leaders you're going to need in the plan, and begin to think about how do you begin to evolve those leaders. Having worked with many clients over multiple years, the point at which they say they recognize they need to develop strong physician leadership, and the point to which they have it is often separated by 3 or 4 years. It takes a while to get there unless you're lucky and blessed with somebody who's really very good, a natural leader. So you need to begin to think about those points very early on in your alignment, in your physician alignment strategy. I've alluded to this already, but you need to address how the management capabilities will grow. So many novice networks just take the managers the physicians had before the hospital acquired the practice and take a manager out of the hospital from accounts receivable or someplace in finance, and that is the management team. And that team doesn't begin to have the capabilities you're ultimately going to need when you have a physician network of 50, 100, 200 physicians. You're growing a very complex organization, and when you're starting out, you don't have the capabilities to manage an organization that complex. We always think people ought to spend a little time on action and financial planning, and we think you need to think about how this integrates with the health system or hospital plan. We've had more than one organization say to us, we've created a monster. We put together a physician network, and they're off kind of doing their own thing, and they're not really integrated with what the health system needs. And that is obviously an enormous mistake. So we put that in the physician alignment strategy that happens when you're just starting, because that's the kind of thing you have to nip in the bud. You've got to make sure that the physician leadership and the network leadership understand that they're part of a broader system with a broader agenda, and they can't set their own agenda. The next phase is the growth mode. And going back to a couple of slides ago, we had two items listed at the bottom under here. I've chosen not to focus too much on fair market value and acquisition capabilities, but obviously if you're growing a physician network, you need the resources to acquire the practices, and you need to make sure you're in compliance when you do it, so fair market value becomes really important. But I've instead decided to put a little more focus on the management infrastructure, and this is the time you really need to be aggressive about defining what that infrastructure is ultimately going to look like. I mean, I would say this is one of the two biggest pain points we see organizations struggling with. I think mostly because if you're growing a physician network and you're in a medium-sized community and all of a sudden you've got 50 doctors employed, it's the first time this community's ever seen a 50 physician network, most likely. And so getting the management in place is a continuous struggle. And we get frequently calls from people asking us for interim help. So can you send somebody to help manage the network? Or can you help us recruit somebody from out of our community who has the capability to manage a big network? Because it's so difficult to find people with large practice management expertise. The other thing we find is there's inadequate backup and support when you do find a good executive. So now I'm thinking of a hospital we worked with where we got someone from Geisinger to go there and run their physician network. And he's done a fabulous job and has been a great find, but there's not a lot of depth around him. So that's an issue many hospitals struggle with. The inability of the hospital CEOs to really coach and monitor the performance of these people is another issue, and not just CEOs, but other executives. So they're hospital executives, not practice management executives, and say that they don't know where the leverage points are, don't know what problems to look for. And that creates a lot of issues as well. We see spans of control that are not reasonable. They're way too large. We see practices with no management data. And so, and we see networks who want to have consistency across their practice locations, but don't begin to have the depth of management they need to do that. So early on in the process, beginning to really think about the management infrastructure is really important. We've done this. One client in particular comes to mind where we put together basically about an 8-year plan. And we said the group is now 35, but it's going to be 150 down the road. And this is what that management infrastructure needs to look like. And every time I run into them, they bring it up because they say it's uncanny. It's basically what they've done, and it's worked really well. But that's the time frame you need to be thinking about, not 3 months down the road or 5 months down the road. But once we have this 150 physician network and it's a $200 million business, how do we need to manage it, and what resources do we need to manage it? I also had a slide in here about the management skills needed for somebody running a physician network. So when we're asked to recruit people for clients, we have a online test that we have them do, and it's one of those where you go through and spend 60 minutes answering questions, and then they tell you whether you have the right skill sets to run a practice. These 9 are the things that we've found to be most highly correlated with somebody who's successful at this. And let me run through them quickly. But first of all, focus on improvement. Obviously, somebody in one of these roles in a fast-growing network has to be unhappy with the status quo and focusing on where do we need more data, how do we do a better job of managing this network, etc. They need to be profit conscious, not that we run into many networks that are profitable. I think 0 is the number. But they need to be aware of the cost and matching that as closely as they can to the revenue that's coming in. They need to take a lot of initiative, have technical competence, because in many cases they're bringing systems into They're bringing management systems into a health system that are new and that were not in that health system or hospital previously. So they've got to have some technical capabilities. They have to embrace taking responsibility and being accountable for results. They've got to be able to learn the business. They hopefully are good experienced practice leaders or physician network managers, but there are idiosyncrasies around any organization, so they've got to be willing to do that. Be able to take control of the business unit. 8 is something that jumps off the page if you work in a hospital, but now you're working with the physicians that are employed by the hospital. So being politically astute, knowing when to push, knowing not when to push, having some judgment about what alliances to create and who to work with, which doctors can help you be successful. All of those become very, very important. And then last, to understand and embrace the strategic vision of the organization. Because again, you don't want a network that's off doing its own thing. You want it to be part of a broader system. These are in order of their importance, although I would push back on that a little bit, but because number 8 seems just incredibly, acutely important, being politically astute. When organizations are entering into the operational chaos phase, there are 2 things we think they need to focus on. One is network performance improvement. So getting back to those skills about focused on improvement, how do we improve our management infrastructure and improve the way we manage the network? And then the second issue is physician leadership. None of these networks are going to be successful. None of your health systems are going to be successful over the long term if you don't have a strong physician network, and you're not going to do that without physician leadership. And I always say to hospital boards, just look at what is required of us under MACRA and MIPS. Look at what's required of us under core measures, and tell me if you think the lay management can do this without physicians. If they raise their hand and say yes, then I know they shouldn't be on the board. They're not smart enough to be on the board. But anyway, so these are 2 things that we encourage organizations to focus on when they're in this stage. In terms of physician leadership, you want to do a number of things and have the physicians help you do a number of things. First of all, ensure engagement of a broad group of physicians. So part of the leader's role is to communicate, to help make sure that the physicians in the network understand where we're trying to go with this, what we're trying to do, how they fit into the broader picture, all those sorts of things. A second thing, and this may be the most critical in reality, is beginning to formally define the culture. So the physician leaders beginning to lay out clear expectations, both for how we're going to interact with patients and how the physicians are going to interact with each other, and how quickly we accept referrals from within our network, and what type of feedback we give to our peer physicians, and how we work as a team to manage patient care and plan patient care. And beginning to be explicit about those things is helpful in my experience as well. Physician accountability is another issue they have to be focused on, and that's related to the quality plan development below. We see a lot of physician leaders getting into these roles and saying what we really need is a plan that crosses service lines, no matter whether it's in an inpatient bed, an outpatient setting, one of our physician offices. So what starts out as a quality plan for the practices ends up being a quality plan that's integrated across the system. And obviously physician leaders who are dedicated to the network solely can't do that on their own. But they have to work with other physicians to make that happen. Next, to push and advocate practice transformation initiatives like Medical Home, to work with everybody on the electronic health record, and begin to lead the onboarding of new physicians. I'm covering some big issues fast. And the onboarding ends up being really a critical issue, because if If you can define the expectations and begin to get physicians to understand what we're trying to do early on in their employment, they're much more likely to stick. They're much more likely to stay and be successful. And so that's something the physician leadership has to advocate and advance. Physician engagement and compensation and helping make sure we're incenting the right behavior, as well as physician engagement and managing the finances of the group are critical as well. Obviously, around quality, you have a lot of work on best practices and reducing variation. Developing other physician leaders is another role. This is a big job description. But we're going to talk in a minute about developing a shared vision. And physician leaders have said to me that having that documented and being able to share that with other physicians has helped them mentor leaders and help them advise leaders on how to coach other physicians. And so the pieces begin to fit together here. But and then making sure that you have enough physician leaders. If you got a group of 100 physicians, you're probably not going to get by with having somebody who's doing this a quarter of their time. It's with 100 physicians, it's over $100 million business, and you need to commit the management resources to make it work, or you're going to have operational chaos and other bedlam. Let me say a few words about network performance improvement as well. I think one of the key elements you have to have is a dashboard that's operationally focused, but this should also say strategically focused. You need an ongoing process to evaluate that, accountability around the metrics, and implement. We're big advocates of dyad relationships, having a physician and a manager responsible for the network together. And so obviously the dashboard concept, though, is important because it begins to lay the markers, lay the key elements, the key strategies or the key metrics that are important to success. Here's kind of the dashboard we like as a starting point, and it varies. It varies from organization to organization. So there may be idiosyncrasies that you have within your organization that mean you should do something different. But first of all, under quality and patient satisfaction, you need an indicator. That may be your choice. It may be Press Ganey. It may be something else. But obviously, you need a patient satisfaction metric. The second thing under that section is the MACRA score. There may other be quality goals you have too. My physician practice had a goal of getting all the appropriate adult immunizations done for patients a couple of years ago. So you may have annual goals on this as well. We did have a question, and I'm going to stop for just a second to address it, but it's about how do I print the slides. And if you got an email from us that had a PDF attachment, or if you go to the HSG Advisors website, scroll down on the homepage till you see the webinar tab. That'll take you to the webinar listing. And if you go to this one about evolving physician networks, you'll be able to see the slides as well. You can download them from there. Thank you. Back to the dashboard. A lot of financial indicators, which I think may be a fact related to the fact that we have a lot of people in operational chaos that we work with. But looking at net loss for the practice, net loss for the per provider, we think is important. Provider cost and other costs as a percentage of revenue. And usually we see revenue's 100%, provider costs may be 65, and other costs may be 55. So you've got 120% of revenue as cost. But tracking that and providing that information to executives within the organization becomes really important. Days in AR and adjusted collection rate, two metrics from your revenue cycle, are important as well. Adjusted collection rate really is saying of the money we ought to collect based on our contracts, what percentage of that do we collect? So it gets away from the silliness of charges versus what you collect and really gets down to looking at the contracts. And of those, what do you collect? Productivity is a big measure and real important to many of our clients. people are not really making the mistake of doing flat contracts much anymore. They're tying them to productivity. But productivity in total and per provider is important to monitor. And then in operations, there are three things we recommend that people monitor. One is access. Access is a common problem around these physician networks. And in many cases, the organization has not set up access standards for different practices. Most people around here like to look at the third available appointment because they think physicians can game the first or the second. But if you look at their third available appointment and when that is available, that's a good measure. So on the dashboard, we just say the percentage of practices meeting the access standards. The next one, specialty capture rate, is really referral management of the referrals out of our employed network. How many of them are staying in network? And then finally, compensation versus productivity. And we like to do a graph where we contrast the two. So a physician may be at the 50th percentile in compensation and the 20th percentile in productivity. That's a problem. We're grossly overpaying them. Or the inverse could be true. They could be at 50 on productivity and be paid at 20%. And unless they're a very loyal physician, you run the risk of losing them. So those are some of the dashboard items we like to collect and share with executives within organizations. Moving to the strategic focus part of the curve, I want to talk quickly about two things here, and I just talked about one of them a bit, but referral management becomes important when you get to this point. And we see networks all over the place. We've seen extreme cases where on referral management, you've had to justify any time you referred out of the network. Most people are not at that aggressive stage, but we'll talk about that more in just a minute. I want to first talk about the shared vision and the strategy that grows out of that. And along with the management infrastructure, I would say this is the biggest long-term barrier to success for networks that we've seen. How this gets articulated to us is we have a bunch of independent practices that have kind of come together, but we really don't have any shared mission. We don't have any shared culture. We don't have anything, and we don't know how to move this process forward. And our observation is that these networks need to step back and define what they want to look like 5 or 10 years down the road. Sometimes when we say 5 to 10 years, people balk because they want to think that they can't do that, but I promise you can. And we found asking that question is very helpful. And it helps the hospitals better articulate what they need the network to evolve into to be successful. So, most hospital executive teams know they're going to have to be more accountable. They're going to have to do a better job of managing the efficiency of care. They're going to get gigged if their quality is low, but they don't really articulate that that's what they need when they talk to their physicians. Likewise, the physicians really haven't articulated what type of network they want to be associated with. And we ask them, if you were proud of the legacy you would leave in 20 or 30 years, describe that legacy to tell us the attributes and the capabilities of the physician network you were in. And that type of discussion gets their juices flowing and leads to some great discussions. And then the strategy pretty much grows out of that automatically. It's kind of scary how it's pretty clear what you need to begin to focus on once you have that vision statement in place. There are two schools of vision statements. One is the pithy, no more than 7 words so everybody can remember it. And that is not what this is. This is a narrative document that's 3 to 4 pages. And actually, one of our clients said that he would describe it better as their constitution. It's kind of the document that drives everything they do, and it gives a certain level of detail so that people understand it at a detail level. So what is in this document? First of all, the desired culture and articulation of some of those cultural norms and standards. We usually see the document talk about how they're going to grow and what they're going to look like from a numbers and a specialty complement perspective down the road. And that obviously overlaps with geographic growth strategies as well when we talk about the complement of providers. Generally, these constitutions say we're going to have better patient care data. We're going to have a common electronic medical record, and we're going to have analytics that help us manage care over the long term, and we're going to be able to mine our own data to find improvement opportunities. We're going to grow physician leadership, and we're going to have physician leaders over the network and over key elements of the network. And so one we did basically said we're going to have physician leaders in 3 elements below the network leaders. 1 is the hospital-based physicians, 2 is primary care, and 3 is specialties. Some organizations might define the surgical and medical specialties, but this document, this vision, this constitution also begins to talk about how they're going to begin to integrate best practices into day-to-day operations, discusses customer expectations. And as I said, this isn't all-encompassing. If you go back and ask the questions of what do you need the network to be to the hospital people and describe the network you'd be proud to be associated with to the physicians, you'll get a lot more ideas about what needs to be in this document. But the strategic priorities kind of flow out of it naturally. I got off on referral retention a little bit earlier and have a slide just to talk about it briefly. But some of our clients refer to it as network integrity, especially if they're in the ACO world and they're trying to, because of risk management issues and serving patients for a fixed dollar issue, they're trying to keep things in their network. And so this is going to grow as networks begin to assume more risk. But you need to understand the flow of referrals to loyal private practice physicians, employed physicians, and non-loyal private practice physicians. So you need to begin to understand the leakage. You must understand the scope of the. When you look at that data, you can't be getting unhappy because we refer cabbage patients out if we don't do cabbages. So we need to look at that in the context of what the hospital can do. But begin to focus on setting improvement goals and working with physicians to earn their business. As I said, we see some networks that are very draconian and say you got to do a written justification if you're going to refer out of the network. Most at least start with the idea that we need to engage physicians in discussions about how we could earn their business. So our clients, we have a data product or referral data product that is joint ventured with a company out of Nashville. And our clients also tend to use it for strategic acquisitions. So if we're thinking about getting into a new market, or we're thinking about employing more family medicine doctors and there's still private practitioners in the market, prioritize those about who would give us the biggest bang for the buck. If we do acquire a practice and we can change their referral patterns, which of the available physicians are going to be most helpful to us from a financial perspective. And then also see clients beginning to use the data to define the expectations of private physicians. So the last 2 bullets, I had an email conversation with an executive this morning about this, because they're a little worried about the compliance issues. And so they're going to focus their referral management efforts on their ACO patients and the physicians in their network that are in the ACO that they have through Medicare. But part of their focus is because they're not a comprehensive network and there's specialties they don't have and they still use private physicians, how do they work with those private physicians to manage the cost of the care those physicians are providing? And how do they build expectations of those private physicians that the patients will come to their hospital? So lots of interesting issues coming up there. In the value-based phase, I have a little less to say about this because fewer hospitals are at this level. But, we see ACOs and risk contracting begin to become very important. We also see a lot of focus on bundled payments and using the infrastructure of these employed networks to kind of help manage all of that. The other thing I have to put a plug in for is direct contracting with employers. Is one of my pet peeves because I think every one of our clients makes at least 95% of their profits from the privately insured patients in their local market. And they don't come from Medicaid for sure. And most of our clients, I can think of 3 that make money off Medicare, but some are making progress in that direction, but they're not there yet. So they make all of their money off privately insured patients, but they never talk to the employers. They abdicate that role to insurance companies. And so I think that's an important thing to stick your toe in as well. I could have spent a lot of time talking about ACOs, direct contracting, or bundled payments. We do work in all 3. But my basic message is, in working with the physician leaders of your employed network, you need to, as a group, stick your toe in the water and begin to take some of this risk. So we have one client that we've done a lot of work with their physician network, and they're taking one-sided risk with an ACO. And again, they're not masters of this yet. And because of the supply of primary care doctors, they don't feel like they're doing the best job of preventative care. But they're beginning to learn what data they need, how to manage patients, how to work with all the primary care physicians within their networks to set up common goals. And that's a great thing to be sticking your toe in the water on. We've got other clients that are doing more focus on bundled payments because Medicare has pushed them in that direction. I've already gotten on my soapbox about direct contracting with employers. And one thing I would say to you that I don't think many people think about is that your employed physicians are a great asset in dealing with local employers. We're big advocates of taking your primary care doctors and saying to an employer, this doctor is available to you to be an advisor. If you want advice on health risk assessments, if you want advice on preventative care, if you want advice on benefit design, this doctor is there for you as your resource and is going to be there to help you. And that's hard to do when all the doctors are in private practice. But once you have them employed, the health systems can use them in roles like that. To state the obvious, there's a long learning curve, and we all have heard a lot of stories about organizations who've gotten into taking risk and have lost their shirt. So it's no panacea. But stick your toe in the water and bring your physician network along with you to help you with this, and you'll be way ahead of the game. I do want to talk about one other thing that inevitably comes up when we're talking about employed networks, which is how to work with private physicians and incorporate them into the discussions. We had a network we were working with in the Midwest, in a hospital that was very financially successful, had a great reputation, and was beginning to employ doctors, but they were really at the point where they were employing about half of the relevant doctors to them, and the other half were still in private practice. So the question becomes, as we focus on our employed network, some of those people in private practice are going to come our way, but as we focus on the employed network, how do we not alienate and likewise not leave behind the private practitioners? And so when we had meetings to talk about the vision of the employed network, we invited the private practitioners in that organization. But my observations are you need to incorporate them into the culture, and your physician leaders of your network are the ones best able to do that. So if we have employed primary care physicians and employed orthopedic surgeons, and we say these are the service standards and access standards and best process standards we're both going to work on, why would we have orthopedic surgeons that are private practice and refer to them if they don't participate in any of that, in any of those things we know are going to improve the quality and efficiency of care? And so lay people can't do this, but physician leaders can. And my first lesson on this was about 6 or 7 years ago. Well, there's another one from about 20 years ago when I was working in a hospital. But basically, if you control a lot of the primary care physicians, you can get the specialist attention. And physician leaders who are in primary care can have the discussion with specialists about what's expected of them. And we want to refer to you. We want to work with you, but you got to work with us on improving. You can't just defend the status quo. And that's really the essence of the second bullet, saying to the private physicians, we want to work with you, but it must be within our set of expectations. And by the way, private physicians, it's best that you work with us on this too, because if you're out there practicing the way you did 20 years ago, you're taking a lot of risk yourself. So we encourage our clients to treat them in network when they're looking at referral flows, to not get in the position where you're creating a contentious situation with those physicians, but be transparent with them and don't pretend like if they don't improve and don't work with you, that they'll get your referrals forever. And again, if your network has a physician advisory council, something like that, we often recommend that somebody off of that council be assigned to work with the private physicians and have the communication responsibility to those private physicians to keep them in the loop, to keep them from getting paranoid, but to tell them, just like us, they got to be accountable too. So we talked about the curve itself. And again, I think probably if I put that curve in front of executives, more people think they fall under operational chaos. We see the second biggest categories being aggressive growth, because we're still seeing some that are growing. And then the strategic phase, where they're beginning to get focused on the strategic issues. So with that, I would see if there are any questions. And I don't think we have any more. So just in closing, I wanted to thank you for your participation in today's webinar. We would appreciate it if you would pay attention to our website, and if there are future webinar events you want to attend, encourage you to attend. You can see those by visiting our website, which is hsgadvisors.com. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.